Welcome back to Holy Breeze. You know, as a Christian, I've always been fascinated by the Old Testament. It's a book that's full of contradictions, violence, and seemingly cruel punishments. And yet, it's also a book that's rich in wisdom, poetry, and promise. But what's always puzzled me is why God would command such brutal acts of violence and destruction. I mean, take the story of the Israelites and the Canaanites, for example. God tells the Israelites to wipe out an entire civilization, including women, children, and even animals. It's a story that's both shocking and disturbing. But before we dive into this topic, let me ask you a question. Have you ever wondered what it was like to live in ancient Israel? Can you imagine being a farmer, a shepherd, or a merchant in a world that's vastly different from our own? A world where God was seen as a powerful, all-knowing deity who could both bless and curse with equal ferocity. Now, let's get back to the story of the Canaanites. According to the book of Deuteronomy, God gives the Israelites a choice. They can either conquer the land and drive out the Canaanites, or they can let the Canaanites live alongside them. But if they choose to let the Canaanites live, they'll be cursed and driven out of the land. It's a choice that's both stark and terrifying. But why would God give the Israelites such a choice? Why would He want them to wipe out an entire civilization? Some biblical scholars believe that the Canaanites were a pagan people who worshipped false gods and idols. And God, in His infinite wisdom, saw fit to punish them for their idolatry. But others argue that the Canaanites were simply a rival nation that threatened the Israelites' very existence. And God, in His sovereignty, saw fit to protect His chosen people. But what about the children, the women, and the animals? Why did God command their destruction as well? Some argue that it was a way of purifying the land, of making it holy and pure for the Israelites. Others believe that it was a way of demonstrating God's power and wrath. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is all well and good, but what about the morality of it all? Can we really justify the destruction of an entire civilization? And what about the children, the women, and the animals? Don't they deserve to live as well? These are questions that have puzzled scholars and theologians for centuries. But before we can answer these questions, we need to understand the historical context in which the Old Testament was written. You see, the Old Testament is a book that's deeply rooted in the culture and society of ancient Israel. It's a book that reflects the values and beliefs of a people who lived in a world that was vastly different from our own. In ancient Israel, the concept of God was very different from what we understand today. God was seen as a powerful, all-knowing deity who could both bless and curse with equal ferocity. He was a God who was intimately involved in the daily lives of His people, who saw everything that happened as a direct result of His will. And yet, despite this intense focus on God, the Old Testament is also a book that's deeply concerned with the human condition. It's a book that explores the complexities of human nature, the struggle between good and evil, and the search for meaning and purpose. But what about the violence and destruction that's present throughout the Old Testament? Can we really justify it? Or is it simply a reflection of the darker aspects of human nature? These are questions that have puzzled scholars and theologians for centuries. One of the most famous biblical scholars of the 20th century, Gerhard von Rad, believed that the violence and destruction in the Old Testament was a reflection of the darker aspects of human nature. He believed that it was a way of confronting the harsh realities of life, of acknowledging the presence of evil and suffering in the world. But others argue that the violence and destruction in the Old Testament was a way of demonstrating God's power and wrath. They believe that it was a way of showing His displeasure with humanity's sinfulness, and of punishing those who refused to follow His commands. So what's the answer? Is the violence and destruction in the Old Testament a reflection of the darker aspects of human nature, or is it a way of demonstrating God's power and wrath? The truth is, we'll never know for certain. But what we do know is that the Old Testament is a book that's full of mysteries and contradictions, a book that challenges us to think deeply about the nature of God and the human condition. And that's precisely why I love the Old Testament. It's a book that's both beautiful and brutal, a book that's full of contradictions and paradoxes. It's a book that challenges us to think deeply about the nature of God and the human condition, and to confront the harsh realities of life. So the next time you're reading the Old Testament, I encourage you to slow down, to reflect on the words and the stories, and to ask yourself the hard questions. What does it mean to be a follower of God? What does it mean to be a human being? And what does it mean to live in a world that's both beautiful and brutal? These are questions that have puzzled scholars and theologians for centuries, and they're questions that will continue to puzzle us for generations to come. But what we do know is that the Old Testament is a book that's full of mysteries and contradictions, a book that challenges us to think deeply about the nature of God and the human condition. And that's why I love the Old Testament. It's a book that's both beautiful and brutal, a book that's full of contradictions and paradoxes. It's a book that challenges us to think deeply about the nature of God and the human condition, and to confront the harsh realities of life. Thanks for joining our thoughts. Subscribe to stay with us. Blessings.